One World Trade Center, which its developers initially called the Freedom Tower before the name was quietly retired in favor of the address, was completed in November 2014 at a cost that the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has never officially confirmed in a single comprehensive public document. The figure most commonly cited by independent analysts and investigative journalists is approximately $3.9 billion. The original budget, established in the years following the September 11th attacks, when the political imperative to rebuild the World Trade Center site was at its maximum intensity and the economic analysis of what rebuilding would cost was at its minimum rigor, was approximately $2 billion. The gap between those two figures is not the forensic subject of this case file. The forensic subject is the specific institutional mechanism by which a public infrastructure project of this scale and this political significance managed to accumulate a cost overrun of approximately $1.9 billion without producing a single comprehensive public budget document that allowed the overrun to be identified, attributed, and explained to the taxpayers and the Port Authority bondholders whose money was funding it. The World Trade Center site reconstruction was the most politically charged construction project in the history of American public infrastructure, a project whose symbolic importance to the national response to the September 11th attacks made political accountability for cost and schedule an afterthought relative to the political accountability for demonstrating that America was rebuilding. That political dynamic is not a sufficient explanation for the cost overrun. It is the context within which the institutional mechanisms that produced the overrun operated, and it is the specific condition that made the absence of a comprehensive public budget document politically tolerable to the Port Authority, to the City of New York, to the State of New York, and to the Congress that had provided federal funding for the reconstruction. The building is completed. It is the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. The budget document that would allow an independent assessment of whether the $3.9 billion was justified has not been published. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey's management of the One World Trade Center construction budget reflected the specific governance challenges of a bi-state public authority whose accountability structure was divided between two governors, two state legislatures, and a federal government that had provided reconstruction funding through mechanisms whose oversight requirements were not consistently applied to the World Trade Center project. The original $2 billion budget for the Freedom Tower, established in 2003, was a political document rather than an engineering estimate. It was assembled to demonstrate that the reconstruction was financially feasible and politically manageable, not to accurately reflect the cost of constructing a 104-floor super-tall skyscraper on a site that required extensive underground infrastructure, security measures unprecedented in commercial construction, and design revisions that the New York Police Department's post-September 11th security requirements imposed at multiple stages of the design process. The NYPD's security consultations produced the most significant single source of documented cost increase: the requirement that the tower's base be constructed as a concrete and steel security bunker capable of withstanding a vehicle bomb of a specific magnitude, a requirement that added substantial cost and weight to the structure's lower floors and that required significant engineering redesign after the original design had been substantially advanced. The covenant that the Port Authority's budget management did not contain was the one requiring a single responsible party to maintain a comprehensive account of all costs, all changes, and all authorizations that would allow an independent auditor to reconcile the original budget to the final cost and explain the difference in a format accessible to the public. The absence of that document is the most consequential institutional failure of the One World Trade Center construction process, more consequential than the overrun itself, because the overrun could be explained and justified if the documentation existed, and because the absence of the documentation makes it impossible to determine whether the overrun was justified, whether it was avoidable, and whether the institutional decisions that produced it were appropriate exercises of the Port Authority's authority. At what point does a public construction project's political significance become a justification for the institutional opacity that prevents accountability for its costs? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology that produced the original $2 billion budget for the Freedom Tower shared the foundational error that this channel has documented across its archive, but expressed through the specific dynamics of politically driven public infrastructure cost estimation. The $2 billion figure was not the product of bottom-up engineering cost estimation applied to a detailed design. It was the product of a top-down political commitment. The reconstruction had to be financially feasible, and $2 billion was the figure that made it appear feasible in the public discourse of 2003. The design that would eventually be built cost $3.9 billion. The gap between the political commitment and the engineering reality accumulated through a series of design changes, security requirement additions, and construction complications whose individual costs were documented in the Port Authority's internal records, but whose aggregate impact on the total project cost was never synthesized in a public document. The security requirements that the NYPD imposed after the original design had been advanced were the largest single documented source of cost increase, adding hundreds of millions of dollars to the project through the reinforced base structure, the setback from the street, and the screening infrastructure that the post-September 11th security environment required. The design changes that successive architectural teams and the site's multiple competing institutional stakeholders, the Port Authority, the Silverstein Properties private development interests, the LMDC, the City and State of New York, and the federal government, imposed through the years of contentious site planning, added further cost through the inefficiency of designing and redesigning a building whose final form was being determined by a political negotiation rather than by a coherent architectural vision. The specific appraisal failure was not in any individual cost estimate. It was in the absence of a process for aggregating and disclosing the cumulative cost of the design revisions, security requirements, and construction complications that the project's political environment continuously introduced. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The institutional denial embedded in the One World Trade Center, cost management, is the most structurally distributed denial documented in this channel's 50-case archive, distinguished from every previous case file by its absence of a single identifiable actor, whose denial of financial reality produced the failure and its presence instead as the emergent product of a multi-institutional incentive structure that collectively produced an outcome no individual had chosen. Every previous case file has identified a specific actor whose denial drove the institutional failure. The Fontainebleau developer who characterized the construction stoppage as lender dysfunction, the Caesars private equity owners who characterized the debt service shortfall as a temporary market condition, the Tishman Speyer underwriting team whose model required rent stabilization to end. Each denial was individual, attributable, and documented in communications that the subsequent proceedings made public. The One World Trade Center cost denial is none of those things. It is institutional and structural, produced by the alignment of multiple parties' individual rational responses to their individual incentive structures in ways that collectively generated the absence of a public budget document. The Port Authority's executive leadership consistently communicated about the project in terms of construction milestones rather than construction costs because the political environment rewarded milestone progress and penalized cost disclosure. The governors of New York and New Jersey, whose appointments controlled the board, had electoral interests in the project's perceived success that comprehensive cost disclosure would have complicated. The federal oversight agencies, whose mandates theoretically required comprehensive cost accountability for federal reconstruction funding, did not exercise that mandate with the specificity the situation required. The construction managers, design teams, security consultants, and institutional stakeholders, whose decisions each contributed to the cost accumulation, operated within contractual and political relationships that made comprehensive cost disclosure inconsistent with their individual interests, producing a systemic silence whose collective effect was the absence of the document that public accountability required. The building stands at 1,776 feet, the year of the Declaration of Independence, expressed in architectural height, a political gesture whose cost has not been publicly reconciled against the budget whose breach it represents. The tallest building in the Western Hemisphere was built with public money and delivered without a public receipt. That specific absence is the institutional failure this case documents, as precisely as any balance sheet, default, or construction loan covenant breach that this channel has previously examined. One World Trade Center has been commercially occupied since its 2014 completion, housing media companies, federal agencies, and corporate tenants whose lease revenue constitutes the commercial justification for the public investment that funded the construction. The Port Authority's occupancy reports for the tower have consistently emphasized the percentage of space that is leased, a metric that demonstrates commercial viability in conventional real estate terms. What those occupancy reports do not provide, and what no public document in the Port Authority's published record provides, is a reconciliation of the $3.9 billion total project cost against the original $2 billion commitment, attributing each significant cost increase to the decision or requirement that produced it, quantifying the decision's cost, identifying the institutional actor who authorized it, and documenting the public interest justification for the expenditure. That document, which would allow an independent analyst to assess whether the $1.9 billion in cost increases above the original commitment was justified, avoidable, or the product of decisions that should not have been authorized, does not exist in the public record. What the One World Trade Center case reveals in the context of this channel's 50-case archive is the specific category of institutional failure that political significance creates in public infrastructure finance. The systematic substitution of political accountability, measured in visible construction progress and symbolic achievement, for financial accountability, measured in cost reconciliation and return on the public investment. Every private sector failure in this archive was eventually subjected to financial accountability through the market mechanisms of debt service, covenant compliance, and creditor enforcement that the private sector deploys against financial mismanagement. The One World Trade Center cost overrun has not been subjected to equivalent accountability because the institutional actors responsible for it are not subject to those same enforcement mechanisms. The tallest building in the Western Hemisphere stands as a genuine architectural achievement, a genuine engineering accomplishment, and a genuine symbol of national resilience. It also stands as evidence of an institutional system that found the political cost of financial transparency higher than the financial cost of public opacity, and that made that judgment consistently and collectively across 20 years of construction and management, without being compelled by any accountability mechanism to revise it. If this case file changed how you evaluate the relationship between political significance and financial accountability in public infrastructure investment, subscribe because the next case examines what happens when private sector financial accountability is applied to a market that public protection had insulated from it for decades. And in the comments, given the Port Authority's documented failure to produce a comprehensive public budget reconciliation for a $3.9 billion public construction project, what specific accountability mechanism should be required for all major public infrastructure projects to ensure that cost overruns are documented, attributed, and explained to the public that funds them? The case file is open. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication. Factual claims, interpretive framing, creative direction, and final content decisions reflect human judgment throughout. This disclosure is provided in accordance with platform transparency standards for AI-assisted content.